Welcome back to the show. We got the one and only James Meta Lawman Murphy with us, and we're going to talk about the SEC versus Ripple and the recent indicative ruling being denied by Judge Annalisa Torres. Somebody roll that beautiful intro.
Digital Perspectives with Brad Kimes. Come on in.
Welcome back. You know, for people old enough, they'll know where that comes from, right? You know, you got to be a certain age to know what that is, right?
Great show.
Great show. It really
Vinny
was.
Barbarino.
Yeah, right. Yes, indeedy. Welcome back, Connor. Well, welcome back to James Murphy right here. James, how you doing this morning?
I'm doing fantastic. Happy Friday to you, Brad. It's always great to be on with you.
It really is, man. And I tell you, boy, we got some information that hit the space. We got a denied ruling from Judge Annalisa Torres in the SEC versus Ripple, and that is to both parties denied. So where do you want to start to unpack this thing, James? Let's give you the floor here.
I guess we could talk about what actually happened, kind of big picture. I think it's important that people don't overreact to this. It was not really a surprise that she decided not to vacate her injunction. And that's what she did. And she kind of rejected the request to lower the penalty to the amount that the parties had agreed to. And so now the parties, the SEC and Ripple, are back at square one to consider what are they going to do now. Now, I am hopeful that they are going to act quickly because, as I said, this ruling was not really a surprise. So I'm hopeful that all of these discussions have already happened. Hey, guys, what are we going to do if she denies it? Because she certainly signaled that in the first go round, you know, when she said it was kind of technically not compliant, but she gave a real signal in there. And I became more confident that she was not going to vacate the injunction when I saw that, because in it, she said, you know, there's a case of the Second Circuit where Judge Rakoff got reversed when he refused to approve an SEC settlement. And she said that case does not apply to this situation. And that was a case not cited to her that I know of. And her point was, when I reject what you're asking me to do, you're not going to get me reversed at the Second Circuit. That was my interpretation as a lawyer reading between the lines, that she's saying, hey, you can come back if you want in a compliant way, but when I reject your request, I will not be reversed by the Second Circuit on that.
Yeah, and look, you called this, man. I mean, like I just covered this again about you. It was like back in March. You said I'm paraphrasing, but you said something to the effect like, don't just assume Judge Annalise Torres is going to vacate this ruling. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Right. Well, two things. There's a high standard. You have to show exceptional circumstances in order to vacate a court injunction. And then secondly, you know, there is a political dimension to this. And I credit John Deaton did about an 11-minute video about the first go round when they, you know, were kind of checked by the judge. You didn't do this right. He said, and he didn't explain what he meant, but he said, I hope this doesn't get political. And that's kind of where I was coming from, that this judge, who's obviously, you know, steeped in Democratic politics, I don't criticize her. I think she's a good judge. It's simply a fact. You know, she comes from the Bronx in a family that's been deep into Democratic politics for generations. She probably didn't like the outcome of the election in November 2024. And so I think she was disinclined to go along with this really 180-degree pivot by the SEC. Forget everything we told you over the course of 4 years. That was all. My cousin Vinny, opening statement after the prosecution went, Vinny got up there and said, yeah, everything that guy said is bullshit. you know? And so she was going to see through this and say, you can tell me whatever you want. There's a crypto task force. There's, change in policy. We're dismissing other cases, blah, blah, blah. You can tell me whatever you want. But what I believe, I'm now Judge Torres, is the only exceptional circumstance here was the election. And that's not good enough for me, period. And of course, she had the signal from Caroline Crenshaw, the commissioner there, who specifically said this is quite rare. Dissents are not unusual about bringing, settling a case, and the terms of settling a case, not really unusual. But to say in that dissent, hey, heads up, court, look at this very carefully. Don't go along with this effort to undo what we have done here at the SEC over the last 4 years in pursuing crypto cases. And basically, I felt like Judge Torres followed that playbook. If you read that thing, it was page after page after page of all of the horrible stuff the SEC had said about Ripple and the dangers of Ripple out there, selling XRP and how they're violating her order even during the case, and over and over and over again, and she's concluded, as I expected, that change in the president and therefore leadership of the SEC is not exceptional circumstances to vacate an injunction.
And you know what's interesting too, to your point about that, you talked about how Caroline Crenshaw, Commissioner Crenshaw, came forward and shared negative opinion about why this should remain the way it is, and they should not lean into this indicative ruling. And, Fred Rispoli also made that argument too, that if you were to see this overturned, you think you would see Commissioner Peirce or Commissioner Atkins now making that plea to the judge that, hey, it's a new day at the SEC. We're trying to right the wrongs of the old guidelines of the previous administration, blah, blah, blah. But none of that was made mention of. So you could see why she didn't move on the ruling. One thing I did like, as much as I didn't want to hear it myself, but one thing I did like is that you don't get the backroom deals. The ruling is the ruling, and there's a process if you don't like the ruling. It's called the appellate process, right?
Right.
So to me, it was really her way, even politically where she stands and all going, yeah, no, the law's the law. So I made a ruling, and if you don't like it, the next step is to follow through with the appeal process, which look, we've had discussions about the idea that this could go all the way to the Supreme Court. The XRP ledger's use and the fact that it has a DEX built into the layer 1, which makes it a world exchange for everything of tokenized value. It seems important enough for me to go to the highest court of the land to solve whatever legal matter that needs to be for the world to use it for the next 300 years plus. But it doesn't mean we have to go that far to get this done. We have Congress, we have legislation, and it's moving at a breakneck pace right now, which is unheard of in Capitol Hill, but it's welcomed. The current landscape where it is, James, what do you see? Where's the outcome here? Where's the gap coverage come from this? Does the deal just stay in place, or is there legislation that's going to come in and gap fill this so Ripple can move forward in a new way?
So that's the important question. Right now, the SEC and Ripple both have live appeals at the Second Circuit. So there's been a lot of statements on social media that the SEC has dropped their appeal. They have not filed a dismissal of their appeal. So the question for both sides now is, do we continue with our appeals? I believe the SEC is extremely unlikely to proceed with their appeal, because that appeal deals with secondary trades of XRP, on the secondary market and sales, to the secondary market, which Judge Torres ruled are not securities transactions. It, in my opinion, having read what Paul Atkins has written, Hester Peirce, Mark Ueda have written, they do not believe that those trades are securities. And so they cannot, in good conscience, proceed with an appeal where they do not believe in the arguments that are being made, that have been made. And so I believe it's highly, highly likely that the SEC will drop their appeal because there aren't enough votes to continue with it. So then it becomes a question of will Ripple continue with their appeal, which deals with those institutional trades pursuant to contracts. And so what you have to do is handicap what is the likelihood of getting a reversal by the Second Circuit, and is it worth that a delay of a couple, maybe a year and a half, something like that, to get to that point. And while I am in the minority in thinking they have a pretty good argument, I would say there's a good likelihood they'll lose on appeal. Remember, what we're talking about is, are these investment contracts? Well, there is a contract between Ripple and the buyer in writing. And as Judge Torres said, and what she was persuaded by, is there are other provisions, about holding periods. We as the institution will receive this amount of XRP at this price, and we will hold it and not distribute it for this period of time. It starts to look like an investment contract, a contract for the purpose of making an investment. And so therefore, you have to really drill down to understand, in my view, it's really more of like a wholesaler contract than an investment contract. But nevertheless, I think that there are impacts to the business of Ripple. I'm not an expert in all the business lines of Ripple and their thinking or any of that stuff. I'm not privy to that, any of that. But the pendency of the case, including the appeals, has an effect as other countries and potential partners look at, do I want to, strike a deal, enter a partnership with Ripple? The pendency of the suit has some effect. So I think they're going to strongly consider dismissing their appeal at roughly the same time the SEC dismisses the appeal, at which time it will all be over, and they will simply have to pay the $125 million penalty, and the injunction will be out there. And I really don't think the injunction is quite as big of a deal as a lot of people are saying.
Yeah, I mean, the markets work the way the markets work. I mean, there was even one take on it that I thought was quite exceptional observation of that idea that things would remain the same, meaning Ripple can't sell directly to institutions. And if we see that take place and then they continue to sell to exchanges and then OTC desks, to me, I mean, there's no harm in that. I mean, there was a person, Ashley Prosper, online that made the great observation that Ripple could actually use that as a marketing aspect to tell people, listen, we can't just dump this stuff on the market. We are restricted by the ruling of the court that we have to go through these exchanges, use the OTC desk. So there's no real heavy dumping happening, which never has been anyway, but just to the point that it would bring market confidence to this asset and using it the way it is. Do you see ultimately this staying the way it is, Ripple running, indirectly through exchanges and OTC desks? Or do you see this ultimately somehow getting sussed out through legislation or some other means, James? What are your thoughts there?
Well, I think that one of the reasons the injunction is not a big deal is they were not asking the judge to undo the summary judgment opinion. The summary judgment opinion says that those contracts with institutions where they're selling XRP with the holding period, et cetera, those are investment contracts, making them securities. That was the holding in the case. So the fact that there's an injunction doesn't change it. If that injunction went away, there's still a case that says you can't do that. that violates the securities laws, whether there's an injunction or not. So the injunction is not that important. It may have a minor impact on Ripple doing private placements of its own stock. I'm not an expert in this area. So there are two kinds of securities lawyers. There are securities lawyers who go to court, me, and then there are securities lawyers who do deals. And so there's Reg D exemptions and various exemptions that this injunction may impact the ability to use those exemptions. It does not impact an IPO, for instance, which is a registered offering, not an exempt offering. You register with the SEC. And the only issue that there is you have to, as an issuer, and I've been in the room for this, as an issuer, you have got to explain everything to the underwriters of the offering in an IPO. And you've got this injunction. You got to say, look, let me explain to you what happened. So there was this Jay Clayton guy, and for, our case was in front of all of the others and got to summary judgment. And so when the Paul Atkins came in and wiped the slate clean with all of the others who hadn't gotten this judgment, they were wiped away completely. Unfortunately, we had this judgment sitting here and a judge who wouldn't undo it and go along with what the SEC wanted to do, which is wipe the slate clean there. So they would understand that. It would just take some conversation. That is the real practical impact of the injunction. It's a disclosure issue. It'll be, in their filings if they ever file for an IPO. Now, one thing people really need to understand, an injunction that says don't violate the securities laws is not unusual. So JP Morgan had 5 cease and desist orders entered by the SEC ordering them not to violate particular securities laws. The Ripple one is Section 5 of the 33 Act. This one is, so there are many other provisions of the securities laws, obviously. JP Morgan had 5 cease and desist orders in 2024 alone, and they seem to be operating just fine and dandy. So it's not as big of a deal as people make it out to be. People within the securities industry understand. You move on. Yeah, you're careful. You're really careful in that area that was, had a spotlight put on it. But it is commonplace on Wall Street for companies to have cease and desist. It's not identical to a court injunction. A cease and desist is established through the SEC's administrative process, but it has the force of law. If you violate the cease and desist, you can be held in contempt. You can be in big trouble, just like an injunction. So they're similar. They're not identical, but similar impact. And my point only is really big organizations on Wall Street function just fine and dandy with those hanging out there.
Yeah, and it does feel like, I have to say too, look, there's a cynical side to me, and I'm not a lawyer. I'm 12 years short of a law degree, but there's a cynical side to me that really I almost feel like some of these injunctions, and they're very commonplace, as you said, but they become almost like a puppeteer string. Like, well, now we've kind of corralled you this way, right? You can't do the whole thing. You can do these things, right? And I've always felt like, and to the tune of Gary Gensler, when he taught at MIT, he would always talk about central monopolists in the financial system. And if they wanted control, you would have to give them some of your company or some of your token in order to enter this realm of the financial world. And I believe that's exactly what's happening here in this case. It's just as much a legal matter as it is an audit and vetted process for Ripple and XRP, because I believe it will be centrally located as a foundational bed in the new Internet of Value out here. As well as many other protocols. I don't think it'd be just one. I think it's going to be a multi-world after all, multi-world protocol world after all. But when I look at all of this stuff and I see where we are, I keep thinking to myself, okay, how much further does this happen? Because that's the question everybody out here wants to know. How much further till the top of this mountain, right? What is your thoughts on this, James? Are we going to see this SEC say, oh, we can write an exemption? Because Stuart Alderani said historic institutional sales, referencing some past phrase about bad
Correct.
actions in the past. Can you speak to that phrase?
Yeah, I think that's exactly what he was signaling. Hey, we're not doing this anymore. And this again is what you would be telling the underwriters if you were doing an IPO. Yeah, that we did that. We litigated it hard. Judge decided what she decided. We've moved on, and now here's our business practices. So I think you're absolutely right. That's what he was signaling. Look, I have tremendous sympathy for the XRP community. Man, this has gone on extraordinarily long. And I think, my guess is that Brad and Stuart are going to call it quits. Do not grasp, victory, defeat from the jaws of victory. I mean, didn't we have, wasn't there a big party, a proper party when this thing was settled by when the decision came down? Let's not forget that they wanted $1 billion and to destroy the entirety of Ripple's business. That did not happen. And so let's remember that, take the win and move on. They don't need my advice. They got great lawyers. They're going to make a decision. If they really, really think they can win at the Second Circuit, they might continue, but my guess is that they won't. And then the thing that hangs out there a little bit is the money. The judge refused to reduce the penalty. Personally, I'm not sure I would have even asked her. Remember with last time we were together, we talked about how common it is to settle a case for less than the judgment that the plaintiff receives because there's an appeal. The plaintiff might lose in the appeal, and therefore, if the plaintiff won $1 million at the trial court, they might settle for 800, 700, whatever, because of the delay, the time it takes. They want their money. They don't get the money until the appeal is done, and they might lose. So you handicap that. And if you're a defendant, you go to them and say, hey, man, I'll give you 400,000. They're like, 400,000, that's crazy. I'll take 950, so now that they went back to the judge, so they could have done the 50, I believe. I don't know that for a fact. I don't have the current SEC enforcement manual that really spells out how you can maneuver around in enforcement cases, but they could have done the 50. But now that they've asked, and she said, no, I'm not changing that. The problem is for Paul Atkins.
Right.
If he agrees, they still have the votes. They already approved 50. Yep. They still have the votes for 50. The problem is Paul Atkins has to go in front of Congress. And Congress is going to say, and maybe even Republicans, it's going to say, hey, Paul, where's that 75 million that's supposed to be in the government treasury? What's up with that? Did you notice that Judge Torres said you're supposed to collect the 125? You only took 50. Where's the 75, Paul? And that's kind of the nicest way he'd be asked that. You can imagine Elizabeth Warren. So unfortunately, I could be wrong, and I kind of hope I'm wrong, but I think they might be stuck with the original 125 at this point.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see, something you touched on earlier, which we've spoken about before, and I think you brilliantly laid out how, the institutional contracts or the investment contracts in the early days of Ripple were ruled as investment contracts, and how you cite them to be wholesale deals. That's exactly how I see them too. And up until now, I felt like that was a placeholder decision by the judge, because we all know that institutions are accredited investor level, so they don't need any disclaimers. So it's ridiculous to call them investment contracts. So I felt like it was this ridiculous decision that handicapped Ripple to force them to sit at the table with the SEC. And it's much like the way my father used to tell us kids, either you guys sit in a room and figure this out, or you're not going to like it if I got to come back in here and figure it out, right? And that's what it felt like. And now, but here we are now, right? This whole process. And then they asked to undo the ruling by some backroom deal, but then bring no weight forward from either side to justify, which you could highlight the injustice. You did here today. All the other cases got dropped. Why is this one still in play, right? So it just feels it feels out of balance, even still today, that there would be this level of scrutiny towards Ripple and XRP in the ledger because of what we've been through and what we've witnessed lift off of the rest of the market out here.
Yeah.
Something feels very off about it, but I don't think it's bad. I think it speaks to the level of importance of the XRP ledger and the role it's about to play in the new financial system, the new digital on-chain economy. I don't know what else to think of it other than that. And I know I'm biased, but you said something when you referenced the difference between what you believe were wholesale contracts and sales versus investment contracts. And it always, every time you say it, it always makes me think of the XRP escrow. And I just start thinking, escrow by definition doesn't mean it belongs to you. It belongs to some other party and it's held in
Right.
escrow. Right?
Yeah. There are a lot of examples of this. I think of De Beers, the diamond company.
Yeah.
They are the 100-pound, 800-pound gorilla in mining diamonds, and they deal with wholesalers who deal with retailers, and they control the supply. I think they control the prices,
Yeah.
and so this is not unheard of what I'm talking about. And like the Howie and the oranges. Well, these big tractor trailer rigs come up and collect the oranges. They're wholesalers. The producer sells to the wholesaler, and of course they sell to the wholesaler at a lower price than retail. The wholesaler's got to make some money. They've got to go drive around to the grocery stores and distribute it. And so there's part of the profit goes to the wholesaler. And that's why it makes sense to me that Ripple sells the XRP at a discount to the wholesalers who have obligations of, holding periods and things like that. So to me, it looks like a wholesale agreement. I can understand why a judge would say, it looks like an investment contract. I get it. And in my view, it's a close call. A lot of people say that Ripple has no argument at all. That's not valid. I disagree with that. But, what really has to stick in the craw is the only reason this happened is Jay Clayton wanted to get going early on this first case in the in the crypto ecosystem, in the crypto community. And that's why it progressed to a judgment. And it's the only reason it doesn't get swept away, just like all the others, and sort of like the final revenge of Gensler and Clayton and Caroline Crenshaw. But the good news is it ain't the end of the world. And in fact, Judge Torres made this point. It was sort of, you have to read between the lines. It was sort of like, hey guys, remember they asked for $1 billion. I gave them a really low amount. What are you doing here? Why? I did you a solid if you read between the lines there at the end of the thing. So let's not forget, it was a victory. It was celebrated as a victory. And my guess is they will put it to bed pretty quickly.
Yeah. So that I was going to say, so that's your final thought there. You think this gets, what do you think happens here? Do you think they both drop the appeals and the case is officially over for good? We're done here. Do you think that happens?
Yeah, when appeals are dismissed, they are dismissed with prejudice. You can't rebring them. To me, the one delay will be the question of whether the SEC must hold another vote, because this is a different settlement. It's a better settlement for the SEC, keeping the injunction, presumably keeping the 125 million. Caroline Crenshaw will still vote against it, but nevertheless, that may delay things. But I can tell you, there's no way the SEC wants to continue with their appeal because they do not believe in the arguments. It is not their position that trading on the secondary market is a bunch of free-floating investment contracts that are secured. It's ridiculous. It was always ridiculous. And so they're not going to pursue that. I'm 99% certain of that, but it may require a vote. And, that could be a few weeks, couple weeks, whatever. And Alderati and Garlinghouse have been thinking about this forever. What do we do if Torres? It's not like I'm the only one who figured out this ain't going a good direction, you know. So what do we do? I think they're probably pretty close to ready,
Yeah.
and I think the ready is to pull the plug on that appeal and not pursue it for another year and a half.
And I would like to remind people the SEC sued Amazon, the SEC sued Microsoft, and the SEC sued Tesla. And they're all doing fantastic now. And again, to my point, this has been a legal case. But in my mind, from my house, from where I'm sitting, this has always been a legal and vetted process before allowing something to make its way with this new innovation inside our new digital on-chain economy and our actual economy itself. Because what this does, we had a conversation offline, before going live, where we talked about how, you said so beautifully how, Bitcoin crowd should be very proud of the entire market where it is today, because Bitcoin did show the world what's possible. And everything out here today is really because of that invention, because of that innovation that was introduced to the world. It's beautiful. I always say, like the first cell phone or the first smartphone, it showed the world what's possible. And now look at where we are. Look at all the beautiful things that have proliferated from just that invention, right? And here we sit today with something like XRP, the Ledger, and Ripple, and how they all work together, all those, the company and the entity and the suite of products, all these things work together to facilitate a new level of moving value at a fraction of a penny of a cost, which is something the world has yet to experience. And I believe it's undeniable, and it will get to experience it. And I couldn't be more excited that we're at least this far down the road. And I'm kind of hoping, look, if they can live with things being where they are, pay the fine, put a bow on this thing, and let's go to work. Because ultimately, I think once we get legislation, we're going to get even more clarity to the
Right.
space, and for everyone, not just for Ripple and XRP, for everyone, which is needed. And then we can truly see the market move into a level of maturation where utility becomes the price driver in this market and not just speculation. And that is a big, big leap of growth right there. It's like going from, preteen to early 20s, right? I mean, there's a jump in growth there when price driver is utility, because it means you're going to find out day to day what's working and what doesn't, what solves a problem for someone and what doesn't, what has the ability to scale and what doesn't. That's the next wave we're about to move into, and I couldn't be more excited. James, final thought from you.
Yeah, Brad, I think the legislation is going to be really important in terms of creating clarity. And once we have that, there's that timeline out there. It's optimistic to get it done by September. But once we have that, I believe we're going to look at this whole picture as the Jay Clayton, Bill Hinman, and Gary Gensler era as the dark ages,
Yeah.
of crypto, where the government was trying to destroy this innovation. And, when I say dark ages, I mean it literally. The chairman of the SEC refusing to tell Congress whether Ethereum is a commodity or a security, asked over and over again, it refuses and takes the position of, we'll let you know when we sue you. It is the opposite of clarity that is supposed to be the hallmark of our system of the rule of law. And so I think when Ripple talks about what happened in their case, it's going to be referenced in the dark ages. Now the light is on when we have a legislative structure the way it's supposed to be. Gary Gensler's not supposed to decide how, crypto assets are going to be treated. The Congress has the responsibility to make the law. They're going to make the law. We're going to join all these other areas, the European Union and others, and have a clear rules of the road. And it will be hopefully a golden age of innovation in this space using this phenomenal new technology. And when Ripple is forced to talk about their case and the injunction, all of that, it will be the product of a bygone dark ages that, thank God, is long gone. And now we're going to function under the rule of law.
Absolutely well said right there. The dark ages and how we're moving into President Trump, as he calls it, the golden age. And I often say, and because I think it's just absolutely spot on what you've just highlighted here, and coming to even a more macro view of exactly what you're pointing out, is one thing that Europe has had that America hasn't had is a renaissance, because we're still a young nation. And this golden age is America's renaissance. There's no question, because we're coming out of that woke culture. We're shattering that paradigm. And what is it, a renaissance? A renaissance, for people out here listening, it is a rebirthing of culture. It's a rebirthing of society as a whole. It is a rebirthing of rehypothecation of technology and medicines. And that's exactly what we're seeing right now happen. And I couldn't be more excited about where we're going, knowing that we collectively, as a society, have chosen to continue to grow and to grab onto the positive side of humanity and embrace it as we move forward. James, thank you for being here.
100%. Thanks a lot, Brad. This was fun.
You got it. We'll catch all of you on the next one.